welcoming you to Dialogue at EPlusTV 6, a special opportunity to visit with Dr. Charles Cox to talk about this book called Monument to Healing. And I'm going to read this, Two Soldiers, The Good Death, 1862-1914. So there are a lot of things to talk about in this. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Steve.
Have you always been writing, or did you start writing after you retired? Or?
Well, I started after I retired. I had the time to do it, and I felt like this story was worth preserving for history and for future generations. So I started this project about 10 years ago.
Wow, okay. Now this is based on family.
Exactly. I grew up in Union City in the early 40s, and my parents lived with my grandparents, and across the street from us was my great-grandmother, Lucy Coble Whiteside, and Lucy Coble Whiteside had lost her father in the Civil War and her father-in-law in the Civil War. So I kept hearing this story as I grew up about this lone soldier that was killed south of Jackson, Tennessee. The family didn't know, they knew he was dead, but they didn't know the circumstances of his death. And 51 years after the war, a federal soldier by the name of Captain James Hartz, who at the time was living in Lincoln, Illinois, wrote a letter to the Jackson Sun. And he detailed the death of Private Coble that occurred off of Hartz Ridge Road, south of Madison County. And he gave a physical description of the soldier, the circumstances of his death, and where he was buried. And my great-grandfather, J.A. Coble, Private Coble's son, read an account of this event in the local paper and decided it might be his father. So he got together with his Middle Tennessee relatives. He was mayor of Union City at the time. He got together with his Lewis County, Middle Tennessee relatives, and they read the Captain Hart's account and decided that it might well be their father. So
because they did not know what had happened.
They really didn't. They had not had closure 51 years after the war. And this happened all over America, both on the north.
So he just didn't come home.
He didn't come home, and unfortunately, there were 620,000 deaths in that terrible war, and over half of them were never, their bodies were never identified. The loved ones never knew what happened. So for years after the war, there was tremendous suffering and anguish across America because, you know, they wanted a good death in those days. They wanted to know the circumstances of their loved one's death and how he died and where the burial took place and so forth. They didn't have that.
All right. So you find out about this letter then in newspapers. So you start researching this. What did they find out then? Did they confirm it was him?
Actually, that's exactly right. J.A. Coble came to Jackson and went to the site off the GM&O Railroad, and he interviewed a Ms. Harris, who was living there as a young woman and remembered the details of Private Coble's burial. And she was able to...
Was he killed by this Union officer?
What had happened when Forrest invaded West Tennessee, there were several engagements. And right before the Battle of Salem Cemetery, he split off a company of soldiers to go south of Jackson to blow up a railroad trestle. Now, this was very important in warfare, and we'll talk about that maybe later. But his mission was to destroy this rail trestle on the M&O Railroad. They did that in the darkness of the early morning hours, and they didn't realize that the federal troops had constructed a blockhouse, a defensive position. So as Private Coble and his company of soldiers approached the railroad, the Federals spotted him and opened fire, and he was killed. And he fell beside the railroad. The rest of the company left because they had no means of reducing a fortified position like a blockhouse. So the mission failed. Then the next morning, Captain Hartz, he was Sergeant Hartz at the time, and he was on duty with 23 Federal soldiers early morning that Private Coble was killed. And they went out, they found the body, and as was customary in that time, they buried the soldier where he fell. And he was buried, and then, as I said, the J. Coble came to Jackson and identified the site.
Did those Union soldiers have any way of identifying him?
Well, they didn't have dog tags in those days, and they didn't.
Okay,
He did
so
get a physical description. He had a clean uniform, red hair, his size, but there was no identification at all.
So they just buried him.
They spared him.
Okay. And so 51 years later, he writes to the Jackson newspaper.
Right. Captain Hartz was an old man by then. He was actually on his deathbed, and as we studied this, we realized that Captain Hartz. I wondered why would a federal captain. I found later that he was an abolitionist. He was a devout Methodist. He was a staunch defender of Abraham Lincoln. Why would he go to the trouble to write about a rebel soldier who was killed? Well, it turns out that he wanted the soldier to have a good death.
Okay. So that was his motive.
That was his motive, and it was also a gesture of reconciliation and healing. You know, in 1914, our country was most concerned. A war was beginning in Europe, and Americans realized that they might shortly be involved in the war, which they were, and it was time, 51 years after the war, for our nation to heal and come together in unity and in forgiveness. So there was a lot of reunions of veterans at that time. They would meet in Gettysburg, the Union and the Confederate soldiers, and they would shake hands, and they would have celebrations and renew friendships, as it should happen. So that was a wave of reconciliation in 1914. And when J. Coble came and identified the site of his father's death, he had a monument constructed. This was a granite monument. Okay. It's been moved to Salem Cemetery, where it was joined in with his compatriots that fought at Salem Cemetery, and it now rests there. And the inscription on this monument, my co-author, Dr. Spurgeon King, has done a lot of research on this, and he's checked the records, and we don't feel there's a monument quite like this in the United States, because what's written on the monument is a gesture of healing from J. Coble to Captain Hartz, a former enemy responsible for his father's death. There's a gesture of healing and reconciliation and forgiveness. So we feel like that inscription is unique. It reads, on this site, December the 19th, 1862, Private James Coble, 10th Forest Cavalry, was killed attempting to storm a federal blockhouse. The details of his death were unknown for 51 years when Captain Hartz wrote the Jackson Sun and the grave was discovered. So this brought closure to the Coble family. It brought a good death. They realized the soldier had died honorably. The circumstances of his death were identified. Captain Hartz achieved closure and satisfaction through his good deeds. So that inscription is what makes the monument unique.
Okay. The book is called Monument to Healing. Dr. Charles Cox is our guest. We'll continue this dialogue in just a moment here at EPlusTV. Welcome back to Dialogue here at EPlusTV 6, a visit with Dr. Charles Cox and his book, Monument to Healing. If you're just joining us, be sure to catch us on replay. We've set the stage for this book, and it's quite poignant, and it's all a part of the history here in West Tennessee. When you heard about all this, then, and the Coble family was able to identify the site or the area, get a monument, then did they ever have any contact with the Union captain?
There were letters after the article appeared in the Jackson Sun. There was correspondence between Private Coble's son, J. Coble, and Captain Hartz. Okay. They wrote letters back and forth. Okay. And I have copies of
those letters.
Have these letters, actually.
What were they saying to each other, Doctor?
Well, it's hard. What do you say to someone who was responsible for your father's death? They were very polite, very concise, very proper, very formal, as you would expect for the 19th century. But basically, Captain Hartz expressed the feeling that he hoped the family would find closure through his efforts, and of course, I'm sure J. Coble felt the same way about Captain Hartz.
When you started your book, did you know a lot of this, or had heard a lot of this, or?
No, I did. I really didn't.
Okay.
I heard about it all my life, and when we moved to Jackson to start surgery practice, 1968, I got my boys together and we went out to find the monument, and it was pretty hard to do. It was 300 yards off the highway on a railroad siding and pretty difficult terrain, but we eventually found the monument.
Okay.
And I mentioned it one day to some history buffs, and they became excited and wanted to know more about it. And,
so they didn't know about it?
I didn't know about it, and they didn't know about it,
Okay.
and there was not much written about the incident.
So this monument was just kind of out there in an area where
Exactly.
wasn't anything else out there?
It was out in a wetlands area. There was no legal easement to it. It was inaccessible throughout part of the year because of the wet soil. Okay. And it was dangerous because the only access was over the railroad, which was a legal easement. So yeah, it was in a pretty desolate location. I thought initially we could have the markers and the historic designation where it was, but as time evolved, it became apparent that this wasn't going to be possible. The public would not be able to see it. So for that reason, it was moved about a year ago to Salem Cemetery Battlefield, where it rests today.
Okay. When did you decide to write this?
Well, about 10 years ago.
Okay.
I realized that there was more to this story of just a lone soldier that was killed in a relatively minor engagement. And as I was not a real history buff at the time, but as I got into it, I realized that there was a real story here. And the more you read about Civil War history, the more impressed you are with the courage on both sides. Now, I realized finally there were two sides to this war. I've been growing up, and as I grew up, I only heard the southern side, but I realized there were two sides to it, and how important the healing was during the period after the war. And it brought our country together to become the greatest nation on earth. Okay.
Not easily.
Not easy.
Okay.
Exactly.
And that became the thing. What do you want people then to understand from this in reading about this monument to healing?
Well, I think there's a number of messages in the book. First of all, it gives an up-to-date account of Forrest's campaign in the West Tennessee, what really happened here in 1862. On a scale of engagements, it was relatively minor, but in the overall picture, it was a major engagement because not only did they attack the railroad system here in West Tennessee in order to disrupt flow of troops and supplies toward Mississippi and ultimately Vicksburg. At the same time, there was an attack from Nashville north by John Hunt Morgan. He invaded Kentucky and interrupted rail and telegraph lines in southern Kentucky. And then General Van Dorn attacked General Grant's vast stores in Holly Springs, Mississippi. They were storing ammunition and goods in order to move toward Vicksburg, which was the ultimate prize. So all of this occurred simultaneously. Right.
It was so important that Grant had to change his tactics and decided to go in by river, right? He realized
that's exactly right. He realized that some of these same soldiers that were fighting in West Tennessee, he was going to have to face when he moved south. And he had to defend the railroads. The railroads were so vitally important to warfare in those days. The first time in history the rails have come into prominence for moving vast numbers of troops and supplies from one point to another. And then the telegraph was important, a very important means of communications. They followed the railway right away. So when the rails were destroyed, the adversaries would destroy the telegraph, so they'd lose their ability to communicate.
The other thing I think has changed, one of the difficulties I think we have in studying history is we know how it turns out. In 1862, nobody knew how this was going to turn out.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
and so it was a
But
very
it did, as you
crucial
say, it did delay Grant's invasion south toward Vicksburg. And General Grant was basically a supply officer, so a logistics officer, so he was very capable of realizing the dangers of doing this without control of the railway and the waterways.
Okay. So this is history in the sense that it describes the campaigns here in West Tennessee, and then it leads into this human story. When you look at the human story now, all these years later, like I said, you've had to learn, as many of us did, there were two sides of this, two sides of this war.
Right.
And when you live in other sections of the country, they have no understanding at all of that southern side of things. What did you learn as a result of getting into this?
Well, I never heard of the concept of the good death. And it was
Even being in your work.
Exactly.
Okay.
The good death, for example, that currently is the hospice movement.
Okay.
We all want a good death. We want to die at home. We want to die surrounded by our loved ones. We want to forgive people of sins. We want to be forgiven of our own sins. So that was extremely important in the 19th century. I think still is. You still see obituaries of someone who passed away, and they'll say they were surrounded by their loving wife of 70 years and their children peaceably at home. So that's still, the good death is still important. And in the 19th century, it was especially important how a person died. Were they courageous? Did they think of their loved ones as they were about to enter battle? That soldiers would write notes to their comrades and say, if I don't make it, be sure my wife knows that I loved her, and our children. So it was a very emotional thing and a very important thing. So I learned about the good death, and also the healing and reconciliation that occurred. And you know, Steve, there's still healing that needs to be done in this country. Yeah. And I think we can learn a lesson from what our forebears did, the way they brought our country together and became united and became a great nation.
Okay. Dr. Charles Cox is with us. The book is called Monument to Healing, and we'll continue this dialogue in just a moment here at EPlusTV. Back to dialogue at EPlusTV 6 and a visit with Dr. Charles Cox, a discussion of his book Monument to Healing, which is based in the Civil War. It covers the Civil War in West Tennessee and also a very personal story connected to his family, and it's quite a unique and special piece of work. And we're going to be introducing a video in just a moment. One thing I've often wondered about, and I wonder if you found it in your research, is that what kept these people motivated to do this? Because that war lasted a long time. Many people left having no idea they'd wind up in prison camps and all these other things that happened on both sides. I mean, and as you talked about, 600,000 people out of a population of 30 million, which is just overwhelming. We don't have a comparable conflict in our history as far as the human cost, the involvement of every family, I would take it, in this country. Riots over drafts and other things, in bread riots in Richmond and New York, anti-draft riots, all this stuff going on. It's a total upheaval. What kept people doing this?
Well, I think there were two motivations. In the South, the average soldier was there because he was defending his state and his home and hearth, his family, his home. He was there in their defense because they were being invaded. In the North, on the other hand, I think that there was a slavery issue, of course, and then there was the issue of the Union. There was a very strong feeling that the nation should not be divided. The nation should stay united. And that's why most of the Northern troops were fighting, was to preserve the Union. The Southern troops were fighting to preserve their homes and protect their families. Okay.
It's amazing that the country came out of this intact. And as you say, yet at the same time, many of the divisions and issues still are discussed and unresolved. There's a fascinating thing. Set up this video that we're about to see. This was done where and by whom?
This was filmed at Parker's Crossroads about 2 months ago, and it will reenact the death of Private Coble, the skirmish off Harts Bridge Road at the rail trestle, It'll show the burial, and it'll have something about the story itself, about the family, about Captain Hartz and Jay Coble and Private Coble.
The success of this seems to be that you've been able to take and weave history of West Tennessee, which is important because this was such a key area, but other than Shiloh, not a monumental battle area yet to this war. And yet, as with every war, there are personal stories in there that have their own context. I would think now that with the ability to digitize and other things, we're going to be finding more diaries, more letters, more other things from which historians will draw a more personal perspective on this, rather than just the viewpoints of generals and mass movements of armies, that there are individual stories there, and it has a real special place. It's really good to have this opportunity to visit with you.
Thank you.
The book is called Monument to Healing, Two Soldiers, The Good Death, 1862-1914, and the video that we're about to see is going to cover that in a special dramatic presentation. We're going to have this opportunity to visit with you.
Thank you, Steve. Good to be here.
Stay with us here at EPlusTV 6. This is the place where the dialogue continues.
December 1862. Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest was given unprecedented orders. His mission: disrupt federal rail and telegraph lines, supplying troops between Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Memphis, Tennessee. Forrest's campaign was so bold, so audacious, and so unprecedented that the raids are still studied at West Point. The fact was, Forrest was always outnumbered, and many times on many missions, darkness and stealth and nerve were required.
And that's where Private Coble came into play. He and Major Nicholas Cox and their group of Middle Tennessee soldiers went to the trestle in the pre-dawn darkness. They had not expected it to be heavily defended, but recently a stockade and blockhouse had been constructed. So as they approached the trestle in the dark of night, the Federal troops spotted them and opened fire.
Private James Coble's body remained on the field, the only casualty of a failed secret mission. However, shortly after his death, the Federals took the unusual step to hastily bury his remains in a shallow grave. His grieving family in Lewis County, Tennessee, had no idea of the cause or place of his burial. And then, out of the blue, a half-century later, a dying Federal soldier decides he has one last wish: to write a letter to share a secret.
In 1914, a letter appeared in the Jackson Sun. It had been written by Captain David Hartz of Lincoln, Illinois. Captain Hartz had been in command of the 23 Federal soldiers that were on duty at the blockhouse where Private Coble was killed.
What in the world motivated this adversary to give this precious gift to his one-time enemy? The answer to that question became the obsession of Private Coble's great-great-grandson, Dr. Charles Cox. The Jackson, Tennessee sergeant put his question on hold, but once in retirement, he threw himself into this great Civil War mystery, a mystery marked by a mayor's involvement around the turn of the century, significant finds and discoveries of relics, and current Tennessee historians' involvement.
So this monument speaks in many ways, and it speaks to us today to remind us what binds us together as a nation and a people.
A mystery that led to one of the most unusual Civil War monuments ever commissioned. The remarkable story behind the monument has caught the attention of the media. Newspapers and television stations are now covering some of the events involving Monument to Healing. What a noble gesture. I get goosebumps right now. It gave the family closure after 51 years. An untold war story that suggests how a country healed through a single death. Monument to Healing, available at charlescox.co.